Picture this. It's 2005. The United States had just spent the previous 4 years pouring over $10 billion into emergency preparedness.
Right, right.
$10 billion to ensure that when the absolute worst happened, the country would be ready. But then Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast.
Yeah, overwhelming the levees.
Exactly, flooding New Orleans.
Yeah.
And over 1,800 people died.
Yeah.
And the statistic that completely stops you in your tracks when you dig into the postmortem of that disaster is this.
It's a rough one.
75% of the people who lost their lives were over the age of 60.
Yeah.
You just have to ask yourself how a system armed with billions of dollars in funding, a system built in the wealthiest nation on Earth, fails its most physically fragile citizens so predictably.
Right, and so utterly.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Grab a coffee, pull up a chair. Today we are unpacking a massive stack of data to figure out exactly who falls through the cracks when a society collapses and why.
It really forces a total reevaluation of how we categorize risk, doesn't it? We are looking at 3 distinct eras of data today to decode this.
Yeah, we've got a lot of ground to cover for you.
We do. First, we have a 2026 presentation synthesizing the Global Humanitarian Assistance Report from 2022. That gives us the big macro-level planetary view.
A bird's eye view.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then we have a deeply granular 2006 epidemiological study by Andrews, Skinner, and Zuma. That one is on children orphaned by the HIV/AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa.
That one is just a heavy read.
It really is.
Yeah.
And finally, we have a comprehensive 2008 legal and ethical framework by Sharona Hoffman. She dissects how American law completely miscalculates the concept of protecting vulnerable populations.
Like during events like Katrina.
Exactly.
What binds all these seemingly disparate sources together is how they utterly dismantle our baseline assumptions. I think a lot of us view vulnerability as this fixed static state.
Right, like a permanent label.
Yeah, exactly. You're young or you're elderly or you use a wheelchair and boom, a label is applied. You are vulnerable.
Which is such a flawed way to look at it.
It totally is. Because poring over these studies, you realize vulnerability isn't just a physical trait or a passive label. It is a cascading series of societal failures.
It's an active, ongoing process of marginalization.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the widest lens possible. If we look at that 2022 Global Humanitarian Assistance Report, the sheer scale of the failure is almost impossible to wrap your head around.
It really is. In 2021, an estimated 306 million people needed humanitarian assistance worldwide.
306 million. That's almost the entire population of the U.S.
Right. And to contextualize that figure, that represents a 90 million person spike from 2019, just prior to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Wow. A 90 million person jump in 2 years.
Yeah. And the geographic concentration of that suffering is staggering. Half of those 306 million people, so over 150 million human beings, live in just 9 countries.
Wait, half the global need is in 9 countries.
Just 9 countries.
That geographic concentration completely shatters the idea that crises are just these random, evenly distributed acts of bad luck. Or bad weather,
Right, it's not random at all.
If half the global need is localized in just 9 nations, we aren't looking at random disasters. We're looking at systemic engineered fragility.
Exactly. And the report identifies the architecture of that fragility by outlining 7 overlapping factors of vulnerability.
What are they?
You have conflict, poverty, climate, displacement, weak healthcare, compounding crises, and protracted crises.
Protracted meaning like long-term.
Right. Historically, the global aid model treated crises as acute, short-term anomalies. An earthquake levels a city, the international community rushes in with pallets of water.
Field hospitals, stuff like that.
Exactly. The city stabilizes, and the aid organizations pack up and leave. But the data completely invalidates that model.
Because it's not short-term anymore.
No. The report identified 36 countries currently locked in what they call protracted crises. These are long-term, multi-decade states of emergency.
Multi-decade. Wow.
And those 36 countries account for 74% of all the people in need globally.
So when I was trying to visualize what a protracted compounding crisis actually looks like on the ground for you all listening, the best analogy I could come up with is a Jenga tower.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right, because the traditional emergency model treats a disaster, like a hurricane, as someone yanking out a block right in the middle of a perfectly stable tower.
Right. The tower might wobble, but it holds.
Exactly. But this report describes a Jenga tower where multiple blocks at the very foundation have already been stripped away over decades. The foundational block of poverty alleviation is gone.
The block of a functioning primary healthcare system is gone.
Yeah. The block of climate stability is gone. The tower is swaying in the breeze before the hurricane even forms off the coast.
And that framework perfectly explains the catastrophic impact of COVID-19 detailed in the data.
Oh, absolutely.
The virus didn't magically create new vulnerabilities in these 36 countries. It exploited the absent blocks. It exacerbated existing food insecurity because supply chains were already fragile.
Because the blocks were missing.
Exactly. It devastated populations because the weak healthcare infrastructure couldn't handle routine care, let alone a novel respiratory virus.
Wow.
The economic fragility was just waiting for a catalyst.
So COVID was just a heavy hand pounding down on top of a Jenga tower that was already missing half its foundation.
That's exactly what the data shows. The presentation quantifies that instability with terrifying precision.
What were the numbers on that?
Out of the 73 countries with populations requiring aid, 37 of them were experiencing more than one type of humanitarian crisis simultaneously.
More than one at the same time.
Yes. And even more alarming, 16 countries were experiencing all three major types of crises at the exact same time: active conflict, natural disaster, and mass displacement.
I mean, try to actually imagine the human reality of that. You are living in a region where armed conflict forces you to flee your home.
So you become displaced.
Right, you become a displaced person walking toward a border or a camp.
Mm-hmm.
But while you are fleeing, a massive climate event like a historic drought or a flood wipes out the agricultural yield of the entire region.
It just piles on.
So now you are in a refugee camp, fleeing a war zone, during a famine, and the healthcare system you rely on has completely evaporated.
And the role of climate as the ultimate accelerant cannot be overstated here. The report notes that 152.6 million people in need reside in highly climate-vulnerable areas.
That's roughly half the global total.
Right. The researchers explicitly designate climate change not just as an environmental concern, but as a risk multiplier.
A risk multiplier. That makes sense.
It degrades the soil, which creates food scarcity. That drives up poverty, which inevitably sparks conflict over remaining resources, which causes displacement. It is the engine driving the compounding crises.
But, staring at a number like 306 million people, it's numbing. The human brain isn't wired to process suffering on a scale of hundreds of millions.
It becomes an abstract statistic.
Exactly. To truly understand how these compounding risks degrade a society and destroy a safety net, we have to zoom all the way in.
We have to look at the micro level.
Right. We need to look at what happens when a community's foundation decays over time, block by block. We need to transition from the global macro data to a highly specific, localized demographic collapse.
So looking at the HIV/AIDS epidemic.
Yeah. Let's look at the epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa in the early 2000s. As detailed in the 2006 epidemiological study by Andrews, Skinner, and Zuma.
This paper captures a demographic catastrophe in real time. By the end of 2003, the epidemic had orphaned 15 million children under the age of 15 in sub-Saharan Africa.
15 million under 15.
And the epidemiological projections at the time estimated that number would balloon to 18 million by 2010.
18 million orphaned children. That is the entire population of a medium-sized European country, composed entirely of kids who have lost their primary caregivers.
To conceptualize how to even begin helping these children, the study relies on a multifaceted definition of vulnerability. It was generated by the Kellogg OVC.
That's the Orphan and Vulnerable Children Project.
Yes. They broke down the needs of these children into three core domains: material problems, emotional problems, and social problems.
Okay, let's break those down.
The material problems are the immediate physical survival needs: a severe lack of access to money, consistent food, adequate clothing, safe shelter, basic health care, and schooling.
So that's the physiological baseline. If you don't have those, you literally don't survive.
But the emotional and social domains are arguably just as destructive to the child's long-term viability. Emotional problems encompass a profound lack of caring, love, support, and critically, the sheer space and permission to grieve.
Because they're in survival mode.
Right. And social problems involve the sudden loss of a supportive peer group, the complete absence of adult role models, and a drastically increased exposure to environmental risks, like physical abuse, child labor, or sexual exploitation.
This study also highlights a fascinating and vital cultural context regarding the word orphan itself. which completely shifts how we view the timeline of vulnerability.
It's a huge distinction.
In Western bureaucratic frameworks, we generally define an orphan strictly as a child whose parents have legally passed away. But the researchers point out that in many African languages, the translation of the word orphan refers to a child who is destitute.
Isolated and without care.
Right. It does not strictly mean their parents are deceased.
That linguistic distinction is incredibly important because it perfectly maps onto the brutal biological reality of the HIV/AIDS epidemic.
Yeah.
A child enters a state of profound vulnerability long before a parent actually takes their last breath. When a parent progresses to severe symptomatic HIV infection, their physical capacity diminishes drastically over a period of years.
They can't do agricultural labor?
Right. They can't hold down a job, generate income, or physically protect their child.
If we go back to our structural analogies, think of a family unit as a structural load-bearing wall in a child's life.
Okay, I'm with you.
A sudden disaster, like an earthquake, might knock that wall down in 10 seconds. But a disease like HIV/AIDS doesn't work like that. It systematically degrades the mortar holding the bricks together over a period of 5, 7, or 10 years.
The wall is still standing, technically.
Yeah, but it provides no shelter. And the child is spending all their energy just trying to hold the crumbling bricks in place.
That's a really powerful way to picture it.
And this is why I have to push back hard on the traditional Western definition of an orphan that bureaucratically cuts off at age 15, which the study heavily critiques too.
Yeah, they strongly disagree with that cutoff.
I mean, why is a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old magically reclassified as not vulnerable by international aid organizations? Especially if that teen is now the de facto head of the household,
Trying to keep 3 younger siblings alive.
while their parents are bedridden. The psychological and economic pressure on that teenager is astronomical.
The authors of the study are in complete agreement with your critique. They argue that imposing a rigid 15-year-old age limit grossly underestimates the actual scope of the humanitarian crisis.
It actively denies critical aid to older teenagers.
Exactly, who are highly vulnerable to exploitation. To truly grasp the magnitude of the pressure you're describing, we need to look at the devastating economic micromechanics detailed in the research.
Let's hear the numbers.
In Welcome, South Africa, researchers conducted a deep dive into household finances. They found that the income of households with an HIV-positive member dropped by more than half.
Dropped by over 50%.
At the exact same time, because of the progression of the illness, that same household was forced to spend 4 times as much on healthcare, medications, and eventual funeral costs.
So wait, your income is slashed by 50% and your medical expenditures increased by 400%.
Yes,
The math is terminal. The household economy just implodes.
it does. And the cascading consequences are immediate and visible in the data. A separate survey in the Limpopo province tracked how these affected households reallocated their remaining diminished funds.
What did they cut first?
They cut their spending on education down to a mere 8.7% of their total budget, compared to 15.6% in not affected homes.
Wow.
The hierarchy of needs collapses. The most common unmet needs in these specific households rapidly become education, baseline caloric intake, routine medical care for the children, and clothing.
And this is where the data reveals how different types of vulnerability intersect and multiply each other. The study explicitly points out the impact on girls in these households.
The gender disparity is massive.
Yeah, in maternal orphan households, where the mother is either deceased or severely ill, girls drop out of school at twice the rate of boys because of deeply entrenched traditional cultural roles.
They are the first to be pulled out of the classroom.
Exactly. They're conscripted to become the primary full-time caregivers for their dying parents, or to take over the child-rearing responsibilities for their younger siblings.
The vulnerability of gender intersects with the vulnerability of the disease. It effectively terminates the girl's educational future and guarantees a cycle of poverty.
It's devastating.
And the ripple effects extend far beyond the immediate nuclear family. When the parents inevitably pass away, the extended family network absorbs the impact.
Who takes them in?
In nearly every country across sub-Saharan Africa during this period, extended families, aunts, uncles, and particularly grandparents took in over 90% of these orphan children.
90%. That's a massive shift.
It led to an unprecedented spike in grandparent-headed households and female-headed households.
Which, economically speaking, are often already the most fragile households in a community before you even add a crisis into the mix.
Precisely. You have an elderly grandmother, often surviving on a meager pension or subsistence farming, and she is suddenly tasked with taking in 3, 4, or 5 traumatized grandchildren.
The strain on resources must be immense.
The study notes the severe nutritional consequences of this absorption. In these intensely strained, overcrowded households operating under extreme poverty, overall food consumption can drop by as much as 40%.
A 40% drop in food consumption for a child whose brain and skeletal system are actively developing.
It leaves them at an exponentially higher risk for acute malnutrition.
Yeah, the consequences of that aren't just a tough couple of years. It causes permanent developmental delays. It affects their cognitive ability, their immune system, their future earning potential.
The economic damage to the nation is locked in for the next 40 years. What's fascinating here is the insidious temporal nature of this specific type of crisis. The epidemiological data reveals a massive silent time lag,
How long is the lag?
estimated at anywhere from 7 to 10 years, and in some cases even longer, between the peak of HIV prevalence in the adult population and the subsequent peak of orphanhood.
I was looking at that 7 to 10 year figure, and the mechanics of it are just brutal. Walk us through exactly how that lag functions on a societal level.
It's dictated entirely by the incubation period of the virus and the natural progression of the disease, especially in the absence of widespread antiretroviral therapy, which was the reality in the early 2000s.
So, year one.
Year 1, a massive wave of young adults becomes infected with HIV. The virus is largely asymptomatic initially. Year 4, the viral load increases, the immune system degrades, and symptomatic illness begins.
So they start getting sick.
Right. The breadwinner starts missing days of work. The agricultural yield of the family plot drops. Year 6, the illness becomes severe. The income plummets by that 50% we discussed.
Medical costs quadruple.
Exactly. And the older children are pulled out of school to provide care. The family's economic and social stability slowly, agonizingly collapses. Year 8 or 9, the parents pass away,
Leaving behind massive debt and traumatized children.
who are then absorbed by the elderly grandparents.
So even if a government implements a brilliant public health campaign in year 3 and successfully halts all new HIV infections, the societal damage is already baked in.
Exactly. Even with 0 new infections, the number of orphans, the strain on the extended family networks, and the collapse of household economies will continue to explode for another decade.
As the people who were infected years prior slowly progress to AIDS and die.
The societal infrastructure continues to crumble, silently and relentlessly, long after the initial public health alarm bells have stopped ringing and the international media has moved on.
It is incredibly sobering to realize that vulnerability can act like a slow-release poison in a population.
It really is.
And it proves that whether we are talking about a slow-moving, decade-long epidemic in Africa or a sudden catastrophic weather event in a major coastal city, the underlying truth remains identical.
The most vulnerable demographics always bear the absolute brunt of the systemic failure.
Exactly. Which leads us directly into our third source and the stark reality of disaster response in the developed world.
This brings us to the 2008 paper by Sharona Hoffman. This text is a masterclass in examining the legal and ethical framework surrounding vulnerable populations during disasters in the United States.
And the contrast between the environment in the Hoffman paper and the African epidemiological study is jarring.
It really is night and day in terms of resources.
Right. The United States is the wealthiest nation in human history. Hoffman notes that following the September 11th attacks, between 2001 and 2005, the federal government poured over $10 billion into domestic emergency preparedness.
$10 billion explicitly allocated to ensure the country was ready for a catastrophic event.
And yet, when Hurricane Katrina made landfall, the system completely disintegrated. Over 1,800 people died. And as we mentioned at the top of the deep dive, 75% of those casualties were over the age of 60.
It serves as a stark, indisputable indictment of how resources are allocated, who sits at the planning table, and whose survival is prioritized in municipal protocols.
So who does the paper define as vulnerable in the U.S.?
The Hoffman text explicitly defines the scope of these groups, proving that we aren't talking about a tiny, marginal fraction of the population. We are talking about tens of millions of citizens.
Give me some of the stats from the paper.
At the time the paper was published, there were 41.3 million non-institutionalized Americans living with disabilities. There were 35.5 million elderly persons, 38.8 million people living below the poverty line.
And what about kids?
Children make up roughly 25% of the total population. Then you have to factor in 2.3 million incarcerated individuals, pregnant women, undocumented workers, and citizens with limited English proficiency.
When you aggregate all those demographics, you're essentially talking about the majority of the population. And the illustrative examples Hoffman uses from Katrina to demonstrate how the multi-billion-dollar system failed, these specific groups are just horrifying.
The specifics are very hard to hear.
I want to share the mechanics of these failures with you just to really paint a picture of what systemic blindness looks like on the ground. Let's look at the disabled community.
Right.
When citizens with disabilities actually managed to survive the floodwaters and evacuate to the designated mega shelters, the nightmare continued. 80% of those Katrina shelters lacked text telephones, or TTYs, for the deaf.
80%.
Yeah, and 60% of the shelters had no open caption capabilities on their televisions or public address systems.
Put yourself in the psychological space of a deaf individual in that scenario. You are in a massive, echoing, chaotic stadium like the Superdome, packed with tens of thousands of panicked, exhausted people.
It would be terrifying.
The military and FEMA are barking out critical, life-saving instructions over a loudspeaker. Evacuation schedules, medical triage locations, food distribution times, and you have absolutely no mechanism to receive that information.
The sheer terror and isolation of that experience would be profound. It is total systemic erasure.
And for those with mobility impairments, the failures extended long after the storm passed. Only 5% of the temporary housing trailers provided by FEMA were wheelchair accessible.
5%, even though a quarter of the displaced population required accessible housing.
It's a massive oversight.
Then you look at the impoverished and minority communities and the assumptions made by emergency planners. In New Orleans, the data showed there were 21,787 Black households that simply did not own a personal vehicle.
Yet the city's primary evacuation plan relied heavily on citizens driving themselves out of the city.
Right. When the mandatory evacuation orders came down, those 21,000 households had no physical mechanism to comply.
They were trapped.
And when a large group of mostly Black refugees, stranded by the floodwaters, tried to save themselves by walking across the Crescent City Connection Bridge to the neighboring unflooded town of Gretna, Louisiana.
This part is unbelievable.
Armed police officers from Gretna barricaded the bridge. They fired warning shots and forcibly turned the refugees back into the flooded disaster zone.
I want to explicitly note for you listening that we are impartially reporting the historical facts, civil rights investigations, and legal records as documented in the source material.
Right, exactly.
Our objective here is not to engage in political punditry. We want to rigorously illustrate how catastrophic planning failures, jurisdictional disputes, and flawed assumptions disproportionately and severely endanger marginalized groups.
Because when a municipal emergency plan fundamentally assumes that every family possesses a private vehicle and a credit card for a hotel,
or assumes that neighboring jurisdictions will automatically welcome thousands of desperate refugees with open arms,
the people who pay the fatal price for those naive assumptions are always the most vulnerable. The Hoffman text also deeply examines the incarcerated population, which is a demographic that is 100% dependent on the state for their physical survival.
They cannot self-evacuate.
Exactly. Hoffman cites a harrowing ACLU report titled Abandoned and Abused, which detailed the absolute breakdown of order at the Orleans Parish Prison, or OPP.
The details from that jail are grim.
When the floodwaters rose and the power grid failed, the deputies literally abandoned their posts. They locked the doors and left. Inmates, including those held on minor infractions or awaiting trial, were locked in their cells as chest-high, sewage-tainted floodwater poured in.
They were trapped for days without food, without clean drinking water.
And without basic ventilation in the sweltering Louisiana heat, they were reduced to breaking the reinforced glass windows and carving holes in the drywall just to get enough oxygen to survive.
It is a textbook, terrifying example of what transpires when a vulnerable population is completely stripped of their agency, and the authorities legally responsible for their custody have no functional, actionable emergency protocols in place.
It's a complete abdication of responsibility.
And the physiological vulnerabilities discussed in the text are just as critical to understand as the systemic and legal ones. Hoffman spends considerable time discussing pediatric vulnerability.
Right, how kids are affected differently.
In emergency planning, there is a dangerous tendency to view children as simply miniature adults. But biologically, their physiology is entirely different, which makes standard adult emergency care not just ineffective, but actively dangerous for them.
I was reading the pediatric physiology section, and it completely reframed how I think about a hospital ward or an emergency triage tent. The biological mechanics are terrifying when you realize how specialized the equipment needs to be.
A child's physiology demands hyper-specialized care, particularly in scenarios involving chemical, biological, or radiological events. Children have significantly higher metabolic rates and faster respiratory rates than adults.
So they breathe faster.
Yes. This means if there is an airborne toxin, a biological agent, or smoke from a massive fire, a child will inhale a much larger dose of that toxin relative to their body weight, and they will do so much faster than an adult standing right next to them.
That's a huge disadvantage.
Their internal anatomy is also more vulnerable. Their livers and spleens are proportionally larger and protrude further below the protective cage of the ribs, making them highly susceptible to severe internal bleeding from blunt force trauma.
And Hoffman even talks about the physics of basic decontamination.
Yes, even something as rudimentary as a chemical decontamination shower. If first responders use the standard high-pressure water hoses designed to rapidly wash industrial chemicals off an adult, that exact same water pressure can cause severe soft tissue injuries.
Lacerations, hypothermia.
Simply because their skin is thinner, their surface area to mass ratio is higher, and their body mass is so much lower.
So if a community hospital is primarily stocked with adult-sized ventilators, adult-dosed intravenous medications, and adult-calibrated decontamination equipment, and a massive disaster strikes,
Children are going to suffer immensely.
and potentially die, simply because the physical infrastructure was never engineered for their biology. Which brings us to the heaviest, most uncomfortable question of this entire deep dive.
Triage question.
Yeah, in the absolute unmitigated chaos of a disaster, when the hospitals are flooded, the power grid is down, the ventilators are running on dying backup batteries, the supply chains are severed, and you only have enough medicine for a fraction of the dying victims in front of you.
It's the worst-case scenario.
How do we decide who gets saved first? Does the healthy 30-year-old adult get the last seat on the rescue helicopter, or does the 75-year-old quadriplegic patient?
You are describing the ultimate ethical nightmare, the triage protocol. How do we allocate life when there is not enough life to go around? Right.
Hoffman breaks down 3 distinct, normative, ethical arguments for resource allocation in these zero-sum scenarios. They are utilitarianism, equal chances, and the best outcome for the least well-off. Let's begin with utilitarianism, which is arguably the most common default.
The classic cold calculus of the greatest good for the greatest number.
Precisely. Utilitarianism seeks to maximize the net aggregate benefit to society. In a chaotic medical triage situation, this philosophy dictates directing your severely limited medical resources, ventilators, antibiotics, surgical time, to the individuals who are most likely to survive the intervention.
And who require the least amount of resources to achieve that survival.
The goal is to produce the maximum absolute number of survivors. However, the dark side of this philosophy is immediate, brutal, and highly discriminatory.
How so?
If a medical professional applies a strict utilitarian framework, they would likely be forced to deny life-saving care to someone with a severe pre-existing disability, an elderly person, or perhaps an impoverished individual with chronic, untreated illnesses.
Because stabilizing them takes too much time. Right, because they require too many resources that could theoretically be deployed to save 3 healthy, able-bodied adults.
It essentially assigns a clinical, mathematical value to a human life based entirely on their baseline health and their physiological efficiency, which, frankly, feels incredibly dystopian and eugenic in practice.
It does.
It means the people who need the most help are the first to be abandoned. So the second philosophy Hoffman presents tries to correct that. It's called equal chances.
And this is where we get introduced to the philosopher John Tarek.
Right. Tarek argues that every single human life is equally valuable to the person experiencing it. So everyone should have an absolutely equal mathematical chance at survival, regardless of their medical complexity or societal status.
He uses a famous, highly debated hypothetical to illustrate this.
Walk us through the hypothetical.
You are a doctor. You have exactly 1 dose of a life-saving drug left. You have 1 patient in bed A who needs the entire massive dose to survive. You have 5 other patients in bed B who only need a tiny fraction, a fifth of the dose each to survive.
So utilitarianism says you give it to the 5.
Utilitarianism says you give it to the 5. Tarek says absolutely not. You flip a coin.
It is a radical, controversial rejection of utilitarian arithmetic.
Torek fundamentally believes that calculating the sum of human lives, deciding that 5 lives mathematically outweigh 1 life, is morally flawed and treats humans as interchangeable commodities rather than individuals.
Wait, so John Saunders argues against this, right? The why the numbers should sometimes count essay.
Yes, Hoffman notes the significant counter-arguments in the text.
Because if I'm reading the philosophy right, Saunders completely dismantles this. He basically scales up Torek's hypothetical to show how morally absurd it becomes at scale.
How does he scale it?
If I have a choice to save one person on an island or 10 billion people on a continent, flipping a coin to decide who lives seems morally insane. You cannot just ignore the magnitude of the suffering. You have to count the numbers at some point.
That's the crux of Saunders' argument.
And frankly, if we look closely at American society, we actually reject strict utilitarianism every single day in our normal legal and economic frameworks.
How do you see that manifesting in daily life?
Think about our federal budgets. If we were a strictly utilitarian society, we would only invest money where it generated the highest economic output. But we don't.
We fund a lot of social programs.
Right. We spend billions of dollars heavily funding special education through the IDEA Act, providing intense individualized resources to children with severe learning disabilities.
Which doesn't fit a strict utilitarian model.
Exactly. We spend astronomical amounts of money on end-of-life care through the Medicare system, extending the lives of the elderly for months or years, even when there's absolutely no future economic return on investment for the state.
We already explicitly prioritize the vulnerable over pure economic efficiency in our normal day-to-day laws.
We recognize the inherent dignity of the vulnerable. Why should a hurricane suddenly instantly revert us to brutal survival of the fittest utilitarianism?
That is an exceptionally strong counterpoint, and it segues perfectly into the third ethical framework Hoffman outlines, the best outcome for the least well-off. This framework relies heavily on the philosophy of John Rawls and his famous concept of the veil of ignorance.
I find the veil of ignorance to be one of the most compelling thought experiments in modern philosophy. Walk us through how it applies to disaster response.
Rawls argues that if you were tasked with designing the rules of a new society, but you had to do so from behind a veil of ignorance, meaning you had absolutely no idea where you would end up in that society once the rules were set.
So you don't know your status.
Right. You don't know if you will be born incredibly wealthy or in grinding poverty. You don't know if you will be an Olympic athlete or born with a severe paralyzing disability. You don't know your race, your gender, or your geographic location.
How would you design the rules?
Rawls argues that any rational actor would inevitably design a system that fiercely, uncompromisingly protects the weakest and most marginalized members of the society, simply as an insurance policy, just in case you ended up being one of them.
So under this specific ethical framework, in a disaster triage scenario, you don't maximize efficiency.
You actually prioritize directing the resources toward the most marginalized demographics, because they have the fewest personal resources, no money, no cars, no private doctors to fall back on.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Philosophy is beautiful in a university classroom, debated over coffee. But a disaster does not happen in a classroom.
It happens in the mud, in the dark, and in the toxic floodwaters.
Exactly. What actually happens when you take these lofty ethical theories and try to enforce them in a federal courtroom after the fact? If an emergency planner acts unethically and abandons a vulnerable group, can you sue the government for failing to uphold the veil of ignorance?
That transition from theoretical ethics to the hard reality of jurisprudence is the core of Hoffman's legal analysis. We move from the philosophical realm to what is essentially a highly flawed legal patchwork.
What are the laws on the books?
Theoretically, on paper, there are robust, powerful legal protections for vulnerable populations during crises. You have the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment.
Okay.
You have the 8th Amendment protecting incarcerated individuals against cruel and unusual punishment. You have the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
If you read that list of statutes, it sounds like an impenetrable legal shield for the vulnerable.
It sounds formidable, but in actual judicial practice, these laws are incredibly difficult to weaponize in the context of a disaster lawsuit. Let's examine the mechanics of the ADA or Title VI, which protects against racial discrimination by agencies receiving federal funding.
Why are they hard to weaponize?
Under these specific statutes, plaintiffs often face a nearly insurmountable burden of proof. They have to prove intentional discrimination.
Intentional, not just accidental.
Right. It is rarely enough to prove in court that a disaster plan simply had a disparate impact, meaning it accidentally, or through sheer incompetence, harmed one demographic group significantly more than another. Hoffman cites a foundational Supreme Court case to illustrate this, Alexander v. Choate.
Break down the backstory of Alexander v. Choate, because the logic the court used there is wild.
In Alexander v. Choate, the state of Tennessee was facing severe budget cuts, so they proposed reducing the number of annual inpatient hospital days covered by state Medicaid from 20 days down to 14 days.
Okay, so cutting 6 days.
The plaintiffs, who were disabled citizens, sued under the Rehabilitation Act. Their argument was entirely logical. A healthy person rarely needs 14 days in a hospital, but a severely disabled person with complex medical needs easily requires more than 14 days.
So therefore, this hard 14-day limit disproportionately and severely harms the disabled community, denying them meaningful access to health care.
It's a clear disparate impact. The policy hurts the vulnerable exponentially more than the healthy.
But the Supreme Court ultimately upheld the state's 14-day limit, right?
Yes. The court ruled that as long as the disabled had the exact same access to the 14 days as the able-bodied, it was not intentional discrimination. The state wasn't actively targeting the disabled out of malice. They were just cutting budgets across the board.
That's a brutal interpretation.
Furthermore, in a later case, Alexander v. Sandoval, the Supreme Court ruled that private citizens do not even have the legal right to sue the government for disparate impact under Title VI. Only the federal government can bring those specific types of suits.
So, translate that into a disaster scenario. If a city emergency manager designs an evacuation plan that relies 100% on public city buses, but they completely forget to order buses equipped with wheelchair lifts,
A very real possibility.
a disabled person who was left behind to drown cannot easily sue the city and win, because the city didn't intend to maliciously leave the disabled behind. They were just recklessly negligent and incompetent.
And the law basically says incompetence isn't a civil rights violation.
Exactly. Proving malicious intent in the chaos of emergency planning is a massive, often impossible legal hurdle.
But the text does note that there are some rare, hard-fought legal victories, right?
Yeah, there are exceptions. Hoffman points to municipal cases like Hawkins v. Town of Shaw or Ammons v. Dade City. In those instances, minority communities actually successfully proved to the courts that they were being intentionally, systematically denied basic municipal services.
Like street paving, fire hydrants, and storm sewers.
Right. Compared to the neighboring white neighborhoods, the evidence of historical neglect was so overwhelming that the courts intervened.
And for the incarcerated populations we discussed earlier.
You have significant rulings like Tillery v. Owen and French v. Owens. Those rulings clearly established that extreme overcrowding combined with horrific, unsanitary physical conditions absolutely violate the Eighth Amendment.
So linking that directly back to the nightmare at the Orleans Parish Prison, during Katrina, locking men in chest-high toxic sewage for days without food or water is a clear, undeniable constitutional violation of the Eighth Amendment.
It is an undeniable violation, but here is the ultimate crushing legal roadblock that Hoffman identifies: immunity.
Right, the immunity doctrines.
Specifically, the doctrines of qualified immunity for individual government officials and sovereign immunity under the 11th Amendment for state governments.
How do those work in a disaster?
Even if an emergency planner creates a terrible, totally inadequate disaster plan that results in deaths, it is practically impossible for victims to sue the government or its officials for financial damages if those officials were performing what the law categorizes as a discretionary function.
Explain the mechanics of a discretionary function and how it acts as a shield.
If a statute says a city may create an evacuation plan or should consider vulnerable populations, the planner is exercising their discretion on how to fulfill that mandate. They are making policy choices and balancing budgets.
And courts don't like to interfere with that.
Right. The courts are deeply hesitant to second-guess the discretionary policy decisions of the executive branch. So if the planner uses their discretion to create a deeply flawed plan, they are generally protected from personal liability by qualified immunity.
So the brutal reality is that you cannot sue a city for being bad at its job.
Generally speaking, no, you cannot.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what Hoffman is fundamentally arguing in this paper is that retroactive lawsuits attempting to sue the government for civil rights violations after the floodwaters have receded and the damage is done are practically impossible to win.
Because the legal hurdles are too high.
Therefore, litigation is not a viable strategy to save lives. The only way to actually protect vulnerable populations and force the system to uphold the veil of ignorance is through proactive, mandatory, highly specific statutory planning.
The law has to force planners to prepare before the disaster strikes.
And it must attach strict, unbendable accountability to those mandates.
Right. If you can't sue your way to safety after the fact, you have to engineer the safety net directly into the law beforehand. You have to remove the discretion.
Exactly.
Which brings us to our final section, re-engineering preparedness. How do we actually take all these failures and build a functional blueprint for survival?
Hoffman provides specific, actionable statutory recommendations to fix these gaping legal holes. And her proposals dovetail perfectly with the framework created by the Bellagio Group's pandemic checklist.
Tell us about the Bellagio Group.
The Bellagio Group was a gathering of top-tier international experts who convened to create a comprehensive checklist for pandemic response. Their core tenets were simple, yet they almost universally ignored in standard planning.
What were the tenets?
Identify the specific disadvantaged groups in your local community, actively involve representatives from those groups in the actual planning process, and explicitly address their unique identified needs in the final published plan.
It goes back to the disability rights slogan. Nothing about us without us.
Yes.
You cannot have a boardroom full of able-bodied, affluent, middle-aged emergency planners trying to guess what a deaf, low-income senior citizen requires during a Category 5 hurricane. They will guess wrong every single time.
You have to have advocates with lived experience in the room holding a pen.
Precisely. To institutionalize this, Hoffman strongly argues for the statutory creation of VPCs, Vulnerable Populations Coordinators.
We have those at the federal level now, right?
Kind of. Following the catastrophic optics of Katrina, the federal government did pass the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act, which actually mandated the creation of a disability coordinator within FEMA.
But Hoffman says that's not enough.
Right. Hoffman argues this concept needs to be vastly aggressively expanded. Every single state emergency agency and every relevant federal agency needs a fully funded, dedicated VPC.
And this official must be legally accountable for advocating for all vulnerable groups.
Not just the disabled, but pediatric populations, the elderly, incarcerated individuals, those living in deep poverty, and citizens with limited English proficiency.
And what are the actual tangible tools these VPCs would use to prevent another Katrina?
One of the primary tools involves data integration, registries and technology. The Department of Justice explicitly recommends creating voluntary, highly confidential registries for the disabled and elderly at the local municipal level.
Think about how this changes the response dynamic.
Yeah, if a hurricane is bearing down on a coast, the local fire department and rescue squads already have a secure, digitized list of exactly which residential addresses house an individual on a life-sustaining ventilator, or who is bedbound, or who is visually impaired.
They don't have to wait for a 911 call.
Exactly. They can proactively dispatch targeted rescue units to those exact coordinates before the grid fails.
Furthermore, this localized data needs to be integrated with widespread, accessible electronic health records, or EHRs.
How does that help in a disaster?
If a pregnant woman is evacuated from a flooded zone and arrives at a military triage tent unconscious, the medical responders need to be able to instantly pull up her EHR to know her severe drug allergies, her medical history, and the precise status of her fetus.
Okay, I have to jump in here with a real-world reality check, because the registry idea has a massive blind spot.
Let's hear it.
Registries and databases sound absolutely brilliant on paper to an emergency manager sitting in a secure ops center. But if I am an undocumented worker, or if I am part of a historically marginalized minority group that has a deep, legally and historically valid distrust of the government,
I see where you're going with this.
I am absolutely under no circumstances voluntarily putting my name, my physical address, and a list of my vulnerabilities onto a centralized government database. It feels like a trap.
It's a huge privacy concern.
What is to stop a different agency like ICE from requisitioning that disaster registry for mass deportations next year? The fear is totally rational.
That is an incredibly astute point, and it is the central friction of emergency management. Hoffman explicitly validates this concern in the text. Building trust within historically marginalized communities is the hardest, most complex part of disaster preparedness.
It doesn't happen overnight.
No. The text clearly notes that a government cannot just launch a website, mandate a registry, and expect terrified people to sign up. Hoffman stresses the vital need for deep, culturally sensitive community engagement, specifically through tabletop training exercises.
And you can't just slap a literal translation on a flyer.
Exactly. You cannot just take a generic evacuation flyer and run it through a literal translation program into Spanish or Vietnamese. You have to translate the cultural nuances and address the specific fears of that community.
Right, the messaging has to sound like it is coming from a human being who actually understands the historical trauma of the community, not just a bureaucrat reading a script.
And most importantly, to overcome that rational fear of registries, the government has to completely bypass its own messengers. They must work directly with trusted, established advocacy groups.
Like who?
Organizations like the AARP, the NAACP, local religious institutions, or the National Council on Disability. The community needs to hear the emergency message and, more importantly, the ironclad guarantees of legal safety and data privacy from voices they already know and trust.
Because they will not trust a stranger in a uniform holding a clipboard asking for their address.
This raises an important question. What about the massive role of the private sector in all of this?
Oh, the private vendors.
Because if you look at how cities actually function, local governments don't actually own all the buses or the private ambulance fleets or the grocery supply chains. They contract almost all of that logistical heavy lifting out to private corporations.
So how do you force a private bus company to care about the veil of ignorance?
Exactly. The privatization of emergency logistics is a massive vulnerability, but Hoffman proposes a brilliant, highly effective legal mechanism to solve it. It relies on the power of the purse.
Contract law, basically.
Right. If a city government signs a multi-million-dollar contract with a private transit company to handle emergency evacuations, that contract must legally require the private company to fully accommodate the disabled.
It has to be written into the deal.
The contract itself must stipulate that a specific mathematically significant percentage of the buses provided must be equipped with functioning wheelchair lifts. If the private company fails to provide those accessible buses during the actual disaster, it is not just a tragic oversight, it is a direct breach of contract.
And then the government can sue the corporation for massive financial damages.
The government can enforce civil rights readiness directly through its purchasing power.
That is a fascinating legal hack. You completely bypass all the constitutional immunity issues and the impossible burden of proving intent under Title VI by just embedding the civil rights protections directly into the vendor's financial contracts.
It creates an immediate, undeniable financial incentive for corporate preparedness, which realistically is often the only incentive that forces a large vendor to change its operational behavior.
So bringing this massive multi-continental deep dive all together, what have we really learned today about the anatomy of a crisis?
It's complex, to say the least.
We've learned that vulnerability isn't just about a virus attacking a T-cell or a Category 5 hurricane hitting a coastline or a temporary lack of money in a bank account. It is the insidious compounding intersection of all of these things. It's a risk multiplier.
It is the Jenga tower that has been silently stripped of its foundational blocks for decades before the storm ever arrives.
From the impoverished, grieving grandmother trying to raise 3 AIDS orphans on reduced rations in sub-Saharan Africa, to the deaf citizen trapped and isolated in the chaotic noise of a Katrina shelter.
To the millions of global citizens locked in protracted, compounding climate and conflict crises.
Disaster response is not just a logistical challenge. It is the ultimate unforgiving test of a society's moral and legal fabric.
And the overarching, undeniable lesson from the epidemiological models, the global humanitarian aid reports, and the harsh legal analysis of U.S. jurisprudence is that we absolutely cannot wait for the disaster to strike to figure out our ethics.
Right.
Retroactive lawsuits do not save lives. Proactive, inclusive, legally mandated, and strictly enforced planning is the only mechanism we have to prevent a natural hazard from devolving into a catastrophic human failure.
So what does this all mean for you? We have spent the last hour thoroughly dissecting physical, economic, and medical vulnerabilities. But as we accelerate into a completely, unavoidably digital future, I want you to think about our society's absolute terrifying reliance on digital infrastructure.
Our smart grids, for example.
Smart grids that control our heat, digital currency and banking systems, centralized telehealth networks, the massive sprawling Internet of Things. If a massive systemic cyber catastrophe strikes tomorrow, a total prolonged digital blackout, does our society's complete dependence on technology create entirely new classes of vulnerable people?
That our current laws and ethical frameworks haven't even begun to conceptualize or categorize yet.
Who becomes the most vulnerable when the digital lights go out and the data disappears?
That is a profoundly chilling but absolutely necessary question for the next generation of emergency planners to consider.
Because maybe in the future, the broken hospital x-ray machine won't just be a metaphor for murky societal diagnostics. It might be literally broken, sitting in the dark, because the grid is down and the software is locked. We want to thank you for pulling up a chair and joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems around you, demand better planning, look out for your neighbors, and we'll catch you next time.